My husband replaced me with a younger woman on Christmas Eve. I sat on a bench, shivering in the snow. When I saw a barefoot man turning blue, I took off my winter boots and gave them to him. 2 hours later, 17 black SUVs surrounded me. The man stepped out and simply said something that, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Claudia, and I thought I knew what heartbreak felt like until December 24th, 2024. I had lived through my mother's death, the stress of nursing school, and countless sleepless nights caring for patients who didn't always make it home. But nothing prepared me for the sound of my husband's voice that evening, cold and detached, as he destroyed 28 years of marriage with a few carefully chosen words. "I can't do this anymore, Claudia." Trent stood in our kitchen, still wearing his gray wool coat, snowflakes melting on his shoulders. He hadn't even bothered to take off his shoes. The scent of cinnamon from the apple pie I'd spent all afternoon baking filled the air between us, a cruel contrast to the ice in his voice. I was wiping my hands on a dish towel, the same red and green one we'd used every Christmas since our 2nd year of marriage. "Do what, honey? You just got home. Sit down, let me make you some coffee." He shook his head, and I noticed how his brown hair had more gray now, how the lines around his eyes seemed deeper. At 57, Trent still looked handsome to me, still the man I'd fallen in love with when I was 27 and believed in forever. "I can't pretend anymore," he said, setting his keys on the counter with deliberate precision. "I haven't been happy for a long time." The dish towel slipped from my fingers. Something in his tone made my chest tighten, the same instinct that had served me well during 30 years of nursing, the ability to sense when something was terribly wrong. "What are you talking about? We were planning to open presents tomorrow morning, remember? You said you got me something special this year." My voice sounded strange in my own ears, higher than usual, desperate. Trent looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my knees weak. Pity. He was looking at me with pity, the way you'd look at a stray dog you couldn't bring yourself to take to the shelter. "There's someone else, Claudia." The words hung in the air like smoke. I gripped the edge of the counter, my fingertips pressing into the cold granite we'd chosen together 3 years ago when we remodeled the kitchen. I'd wanted marble, but Trent said granite was more practical. Practical. Everything in our life had become practical. "Someone else?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "Her name is Jessica. She's—" He paused, running his hand through his hair the way he did when he was nervous. "She's 28. 28. The same age I was when I married him." The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I sank onto one of the kitchen stools, my legs no longer able to support me. "How long?" I managed to ask. 8 months. 8 months. While I'd been planning our anniversary dinner, while I'd been picking out Christmas presents, while I'd been lying in bed next to him every night, trusting and oblivious. "She makes me feel young again," Trent continued, and I realized he'd prepared this speech. These weren't spontaneous words torn from his heart. They were calculated, rehearsed. "She laughs at my jokes. She wants to try new things, go new places. With you, everything is so what?" I whispered. "Predictable, safe, old. The word lodged itself in my throat like a stone. I thought about my body. 55 years of living etched in lines around my eyes, in the softness of my belly, in the gray I'd started covering with hair dye 2 years ago. I thought about Jessica, 28 and fresh, with smooth skin and bright eyes and a future full of possibilities. "I see." I stood up slowly, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "When are you leaving?" "Tonight. I've already moved most of my things to her apartment. I just came back to." He gestured vaguely at the house around us, at the Christmas tree we'd decorated together, at the photos on the walls chronicling nearly 3 decades of shared life. "To tell you?" "How considerate of you to wait until Christmas Eve." He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I wanted to wait until after the holidays, but she said it wasn't fair to either of us to keep pretending," she said. This 28-year-old woman had been making decisions about my marriage, about my life, and I hadn't even known she existed. The house is in both our names, I said, surprised by my own practicality in that moment. We'll need to discuss— Keep it, Trent interrupted. I don't want to fight over things, Claudia. I just want to be happy. Happy. As if happiness was something he could only find by destroying someone else's life. As if our 28 years together had been nothing but misery for him. I walked to the window, looking out at the snow falling steadily on our neighborhood. Every house was decorated with lights, warm yellow glows spilling from windows where families were probably gathered around dinner tables, sharing stories and laughter. I pressed my palm against the cold glass. Did you ever love me? I asked without turning around. The silence stretched so long that I thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was softer than it had been all evening. I did. But people change, Claudia. I changed. I turned to face him one last time. He was standing by the door, keys in hand, ready to walk out of our life forever. He looked younger somehow, as if the confession had lifted a weight from his shoulders. I hope she makes you happy, Trent. I really do. He blinked, clearly surprised by my response. Maybe he'd expected tears, screaming, begging. A month ago, he might have gotten all of that. But standing there in our kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd thought was solid, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not the sharp, sweet relief of good news, but the quiet relief of finally understanding something that had been confusing you for a long time. Claudia, Go, I said quietly. Just go. After he left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the silence. The house felt enormous around me, every room echoing with memories that would never feel the same again. I walked through the living room, past the Christmas tree with presents I'd wrapped so carefully underneath it, past the mantel where our wedding photos smiled down at a marriage that no longer existed. I grabbed my winter coat from the closet, wound my blue wool scarf around my neck, the one my mother had knitted for me before she died, and stepped out into the night. The snow was falling harder now, covering the world in pristine white, erasing everything that had come before. I had nowhere to go and no one to call. Our friends had all been couple friends, and I couldn't bear the thought of explaining what had happened. My sister lived in California, and it was too late to call. I was alone in a way I'd never been before, not even in the days after my mother's funeral. So I walked. Through our neighborhood with its perfect houses and perfect families, past the elementary school where I'd volunteered for years, past the church where Trent and I had been married on a bright June morning when we thought love was enough to last forever. The snow soaked through my boots and my feet began to go numb, but I kept walking. I needed to move, needed to feel something other than the hollow ache in my chest. The streets were empty. Everyone else was home with their families, safe and warm and loved. Eventually, I found myself at Memorial Park, the place where Trent and I used to bring picnics in the early years of our marriage. There was a bench near the pond, half buried in snow, and I brushed it off and sat down. The metal was so cold it burned through my jeans, but I didn't care. I sat there in the falling snow and finally let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. 28 years of marriage, gone. The future I'd planned, erased. The man I'd loved and trusted had been living a double life, and I'd been too trusting or too foolish to see it. But as I sat there, something strange began to happen. Underneath the pain and shock, I felt something else stirring. Something I hadn't felt in years. It took me a moment to recognize what it was. Freedom. For the first time in decades, I had no one to cook dinner for, no one's schedule to coordinate with mine, no one's needs to consider before my own. The thought terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. The snow continued to fall, and I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed midnight. Christmas Day had arrived, and I was spending it alone on a park bench. My marriage over, my future uncertain. And somehow, despite everything, I was still breathing. I must have sat on that bench for over an hour, watching the snow fall and feeling sorry for myself. The cold had seeped through my coat, through my jeans, into my very bones. My fingers were numb despite my gloves, and I could no longer feel my toes in my boots. But I couldn't bring myself to get up, to face the empty house that no longer felt like home. The park was completely deserted. Who else would be crazy enough to be outside in this weather on Christmas morning? The streetlights created small pools of yellow light in the darkness, and beyond them, everything faded into white silence. Even the usual city sounds seemed muffled by the heavy snow. I was just beginning to think I should head back when I heard something that made me lift my head. Footsteps, uneven and shuffling, coming from the direction of the main path. I squinted through the falling snow and saw a figure approaching, moving slowly and carefully. As he got closer, I could see it was a man, probably in his 60s, wearing what looked like several layers of clothing that had seen better days. His hair was gray and unkempt, his beard scraggly, and he walked with the careful gait of someone who wasn't entirely steady on his feet. But what shocked me most was his feet themselves. He was barefoot. In this weather, with snow covering everything and the temperature well below freezing, this man was walking through the park with no shoes or socks. His feet were so red they looked almost purple in the dim light, and he was moving with obvious pain. My nursing instincts kicked in immediately. Frostbite was a real danger in these conditions. This man could lose his toes, or worse, if he didn't get warm soon. I stood up from the bench, my own problems suddenly seeming insignificant. "Sir, are you all right?" He stopped walking and looked at me with surprise, as if he hadn't noticed I was there. His eyes were a startling blue, even in the dim light, and they held an intelligence that seemed at odds with his disheveled appearance. "Just trying to find somewhere warm," he said, and his voice was hoarse, probably from the cold. "Shelters are all full on Christmas Eve. Holiday spirit only goes so far, you know." I looked down at his feet again, wincing at the sight. His toes were white now, which was even more alarming than the red had been. "Your feet? You need medical attention. That looks like frostbite." He glanced down at his feet with a sort of detached interest. "Yeah, lost my shoes a couple days ago. Someone took them while I was sleeping." Funny thing about being homeless, you learn that people will steal anything, even from someone who has nothing. My heart clenched. Here I was, feeling sorry for myself because my husband left me for a younger woman, and this man was literally freezing to death on the streets. I looked at my own feet, warm and dry in my sturdy brown leather boots. They were good boots, waterproof and insulated, bought just last month when Trent complained that my old ones looked shabby. Without thinking, I sat back down on the bench and began untying my laces. "What are you doing?" the man asked, moving closer. "Taking off my boots," I said, pulling off the first one. The cold air hit my sock-covered foot immediately, but I ignored it and started on the second boot. "Lady, you can't give me your shoes. You'll freeze." I looked up at him, both boots now in my hands. "You'll die if you keep walking around barefoot in this weather." "I'll be fine. I have thick socks and I don't have far to go." This was a lie. I had at least a 20-minute walk back to my house, but looking at this man's feet, I knew I couldn't live with myself if I walked away. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with pride and desperation. "I can't take your boots. That's not right." "My name is Claudia," I said, standing up and holding the boots out to him. "And it's Christmas morning. Let me do one good thing today, okay? Please." Something in my voice must have convinced him, because he slowly reached out and took the boots. His hands were shaking, whether from cold or emotion, I couldn't tell. "I'm Marcus," he said quietly, "and thank you. You have no idea what this means." I watched as he sat down on the bench and pulled on my boots. They were a little big on him, but they would work. The relief on his face when his feet were covered and warm was worth every step I'd have to take in the snow. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, standing up and testing the fit. "I mean, really sure? Because once you walk away, I don't think you'll see these boots again." I smiled, and it felt strange because I hadn't smiled in hours. "I'm sure. My mother always told me that when you help someone, you shouldn't expect anything back. That's not helping. That's investing." Marcus looked at me with those sharp blue eyes, and I felt like he was really seeing me, maybe the first person to really see me in years. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. She died 5 years ago, but I still hear her voice sometimes, telling me to do the right thing even when it's hard. I wrapped my arms around myself, partly for warmth and partly because talking about my mother always made me feel vulnerable. "What are you doing out here on Christmas morning?" Marcus asked. "If you don't mind me asking, most people are home with their families." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My husband left me tonight. Well, last night now, I guess. For someone younger. I didn't really have anywhere else to go." Marcus's expression softened. "I'm sorry, that's rough, especially on Christmas." "Could be worse," I said, looking at him. "I could be homeless and barefoot in a snowstorm." He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his whole face. "You've got a point there. Though heartbreak is its own kind of cold, isn't it?" I nodded, surprised by how accurately he'd described what I was feeling. "It is." We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, two broken people who'd found each other in the snow. Then Marcus reached into one of his many pockets and pulled out something small and metallic. "I want you to have this," he said, holding out what looked like a simple silver coin. "It's not worth much, but it's all I have to give you." I took the coin, feeling its weight in my palm. It was warm, as if it had been in his pocket for a long time. There was an inscription on it, but it was too dark to read. "Thank you," I said, closing my fingers around it. "But you really don't need to give me anything." "Yes, I do," Marcus said firmly. "You gave me something precious when you didn't have to. I need to give you something back, even if it's small." I slipped the coin into my coat pocket, touched by his insistence on reciprocating. "Where will you go now?" "There's an all-night diner about 6 blocks from here. If I can make it that far, I can probably sit there until morning, maybe get some coffee." He looked down at the boots again. "Thanks to you, I actually have a chance of making it." "Be careful," I said, meaning it. "And Marcus, I hope things get better for you." "They already have," he said. "And Claudia, I hope you realize you're worth more than any man who would leave you for someone younger. Sometimes the people who hurt us do us the biggest favor of our lives without meaning to." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, his footsteps sure and steady now in my boots. I watched until he disappeared into the swirling snow, and then I was alone again. The walk home was brutal. The snow soaked through my socks immediately, and by the time I'd gone 2 blocks, I couldn't feel my feet at all. But somehow, I felt warmer inside than I had all evening. For the first time since Trent had walked out, I'd done something that mattered, something good and pure and right. I kept thinking about what Marcus had said, that sometimes the people who hurt us do us the biggest favor without meaning to. Maybe he was right. Maybe Trent leaving wasn't the end of my life, but the beginning of something new. When I finally made it back to my house, I ran a hot bath and soaked my frozen feet until feeling returned to them. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my kitchen, still wearing my wet clothes, still processing everything that had happened. The coin Marcus had given me sat on the counter next to my teacup. In the light, I could see the inscription clearly now. It read, "Kindness is the only investment that never fails." I picked it up and turned it over in my fingers, wondering about this strange man who spoke like a philosopher and carried inspirational coins in his pocket. There had been something about him, something that didn't quite fit with his appearance. The way he spoke, the intelligence in his eyes, even his posture when he wasn't struggling with pain from the cold. But then I shook my head. It didn't matter who he was or where he'd come from. What mattered was that I'd helped someone when they needed it, and in return he'd reminded me that I still had value, even if my husband couldn't see it. I finished my tea and finally went to bed, still thinking about blue eyes and silver coins and the strange comfort I'd found in giving away my boots to a stranger. For the first time in hours, I fell asleep easily, and I dreamed of warm feet and kind words, and the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. I had no idea that in less than 48 hours, my entire life would change in ways I could never have imagined. 2 days had passed since that snowy Christmas morning encounter, and I was beginning to think I'd dreamed the whole thing. The silver coin sat on my nightstand, the only proof that Marcus had been real. I'd spent most of Boxing Day in my pajamas, alternating between crying over my failed marriage and trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. The house felt different now that Trent was gone. Not just empty, abandoned. Every room held memories that now felt like lies, and I found myself avoiding the places where we'd been happiest. The kitchen where we used to cook together, the living room where we'd watched movies, our bedroom, which I couldn't bring myself to enter. I'd made myself a nest on the living room couch, surrounding myself with blankets and tissues and the remote control. Daytime television had become my companion, mindless background noise to fill the silence that threatened to swallow me whole. It was just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon when I heard the sound that would change everything. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the rumble was too consistent, too mechanical. I muted the TV and listened more carefully. Car engines. Multiple car engines. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and shuffled to the front window, expecting to see maybe a delivery truck or the snowplow making another pass through the neighborhood. Instead, I saw something that made me think I was hallucinating. 17 black SUVs were pulling up to my house in perfect formation, like something out of a movie. They lined both sides of the street, their windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. The vehicles were identical, expensive-looking, pristine despite the slushy roads, with license plates I couldn't quite make out from this distance. My first thought was that there had been some kind of mistake. Maybe they were looking for someone else in the neighborhood. Maybe it was some kind of government operation that had nothing to do with me. Then the doors started opening. Men in black suits emerged from each vehicle, moving with military precision. They weren't threatening. They kept their distance from my house, positioning themselves along the street like an honor guard. But their presence was unmistakably intentional. My heart was pounding as I stepped away from the window. This couldn't be about me. I was a 55-year-old retired nurse whose biggest crime was jaywalking. I didn't know anyone important enough to warrant this kind of attention. The doorbell rang, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I crept back to the window and peered out carefully. A single man stood on my front porch, wearing the same type of black suit as the others, but somehow managing to look less intimidating. He was facing away from me, but something about his posture was familiar. When he turned around, I gasped. It was Marcus. But not the homeless man I'd met in the park. This Marcus was clean-shaven, his gray hair neatly styled, wearing what was obviously an expensive suit. He looked like he'd stepped out of a boardroom rather than off the streets. With trembling hands, I unlocked the front door and opened it just enough to peer out. "Marcus?" He smiled, the same warm smile I remembered from Christmas morning. "Hello, Claudia. May I come in? I think we need to talk." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. "I don't understand. You said you were homeless. I was testing something," he said gently. Testing whether there was still genuine kindness in the world, whether there were still people who would help a stranger without expecting anything in return. He gestured toward the street full of SUVs. "You passed that test in ways I never expected." I opened the door wider, still clutching my blanket around me like armor. "Who are you? Really?" "My name is Marcus Wellington," he said, stepping inside when I motioned for him to enter. "I own Wellington Industries. You might have heard of us. We have interests in technology, real estate, renewable energy, and charitable foundations." Wellington Industries. Even I knew that name. They owned half the skyscrapers in the city and had their fingers in everything from software development to wind farms. The man standing in my living room wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the richest people in the country. "You're a billionaire," I said weakly, sinking onto my couch. $3.7 billion, according to the latest estimates, he said with a slight smile. "But that's not why I'm here." I stared at him, trying to reconcile this polished businessman with the barefoot man I'd met in the park. "I gave you my boots, my $20 boots from Target." "The most valuable gift anyone has given me in years," Marcus said seriously. He sat down in the chair across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Claudia, can I tell you why I was really in that park?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. 6 months ago, my wife died. Cancer. We'd been married for 32 years, and she was. She was everything to me. The funeral was a circus. Hundreds of people who barely knew her, all offering condolences while calculating how her death might affect their business relationships with me. His voice grew quieter, more pained. In the weeks after she died, I realized I didn't know who my real friends were anymore. Everyone wanted something from me. Money, connections, favors. I started to wonder if anyone would help Marcus Wellington if he wasn't Marcus Wellington, you know? I was beginning to understand. So you decided to find out. I've been doing this for months, he confirmed. Disguising myself, going to different parts of the city, seeing how people treat someone they think has nothing to offer them. Most people walked past me like I was invisible. Some were actively cruel. A few gave me spare change or pointed me toward a shelter, which was kind, but... He paused. You were the first person who gave me something you actually needed. Something that would cause you real discomfort to lose. They were just boots, I protested weakly. No, they weren't. You were sitting on that bench in the snow, clearly dealing with your own crisis, and you saw someone in worse shape than you and immediately acted to help them. You didn't ask questions, didn't lecture me about how I'd gotten into that situation, didn't make me prove I deserved help. You just saw a need and filled it. I felt tears starting to form in my eyes. I couldn't just let you freeze to death. Most people could have. Most people did. All the times I tried this experiment before. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out my brown leather boots. I had these cleaned and waterproofed. I was hoping you'd let me return them. I took the boots, running my fingers over the familiar leather. They looked better than they had when I bought them. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. But Claudia, I didn't come here just to return your boots. I came to offer you something. I looked up at him confused. What could you possibly offer me? I mean, thank you for the thought. But I don't need charity. Marcus smiled. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a job. A job? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm a retired nurse. What could I possibly do for someone like you? The Wellington Foundation is my philanthropic arm. We give away approximately $200 million a year to various causes: homeless shelters, medical research, education programs, disaster relief. Right now, that foundation is run by people with business degrees and financial expertise, but no real understanding of what it means to need help. He leaned back in his chair, studying my face. What I learned about you in those few minutes in the park told me more about your character than most people reveal in years of knowing them. You have something that can't be taught and can't be bought. Genuine compassion paired with the courage to act on it. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You want me to work for your foundation? I want you to help me rebuild it. Make it more than just a tax write-off. Make it something that actually changes lives. His voice grew more passionate as he spoke. I've been thinking about this since Christmas morning. What if we had someone running our charitable giving who understood what it felt like to really need help? Someone who'd spent their career caring for people, not managing portfolios. My mind was reeling. I don't have any experience in philanthropy. I wouldn't know where to start. You'd learn, and you wouldn't be doing it alone. I'd be working alongside you. This project has become personal for me. Marcus paused. The salary would be $120,000 per year, plus full benefits and a housing allowance if you wanted to relocate closer to our main offices. $120,000, more than I'd ever made as a nurse, more than Trent made in sales, enough to build a new life, to be completely independent. Why me? I asked quietly. You could have anyone, people with degrees from fancy schools, people with experience in this field, because those people would see helping others as their job. For you, it's who you are. Marcus stood up, smoothing down his suit jacket. I'm not expecting an answer today. This is a big decision, and you've been through a lot lately. Take some time to think about it. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a business card. My personal number is on there. Call me when you're ready to talk, whether that's yes or no. I took the card, my fingers trembling slightly. The paper was heavy, expensive, with raised lettering that spelled out Marcus Wellington, CEO, Wellington Industries. I have one question, I said as he moved toward the door. Anything. That coin you gave me, the one with the inscription about kindness being an investment that never fails. Did you have that made specially for your test? Marcus paused, his hand on the doorknob. When he turned back to me, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. That was my wife's coin. She carried it everywhere, said it reminded her why we were put on this earth. I've been carrying it since she died, and I've never given it to anyone else. He smiled softly. She would have liked you, Claudia. She would have said you were exactly the kind of person the world needs more of. After he left, I sat in my living room for a long time, holding the business card and staring at the empty street where 17 black SUVs had been parked just minutes before. Everything felt surreal, like I'd fallen asleep watching TV and was having the most vivid dream of my life. But the boots sitting beside me were real, and so was the card in my hand. I thought about Marcus's offer, about the possibility of starting over completely. For 28 years, I'd defined myself as Trent's wife. Before that, I'd been a nurse, caring for others but always within the structure someone else had created. Now, I was being offered the chance to build something new, something meaningful, to take everything I'd learned about caring for people and use it on a scale I'd never imagined. The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. I looked at the caller ID and saw Trent's name. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something made me answer. Claudia? His voice sounded strained. I need to talk to you. Can I come over? I looked around my living room, at the blankets and tissues that marked my days of wallowing, at the business card that represented a future I'd never dared to imagine. Actually, Trent, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm not ready to talk to you yet. But Claudia, I've been thinking— So have I interrupted. And right now, I need to focus on figuring out what comes next for me, alone. I hung up before he could respond, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt something that might have been the beginning of hope. The business card sat on my kitchen table for 3 days, pristine white against the worn wood surface, like a portal to a life I couldn't quite believe was being offered to me. I'd picked it up dozens of times, running my fingers over the raised lettering, memorizing Marcus Wellington's phone number without meaning to. $120,000 a year. The number kept echoing in my head. It was more money than I'd ever imagined making. Enough to travel, to buy a new house, to never have to worry about whether I could afford to replace my aging car. But more than the money, it was the possibility of purpose that kept me awake at night. I'd been a nurse for 30 years, and I'd loved it. But I'd always worked within systems created by other people, following protocols written by committees I'd never met. Marcus was offering me the chance to build something from the ground up, to use everything I'd learned about human nature and suffering and healing in ways I'd never considered. But doubt crept in every time I started to get excited about the opportunity. What did I know about running a foundation? What if I failed? What if Marcus realized he'd made a mistake and I embarrassed myself? What if this was all too good to be true? I was wrestling with these thoughts when the doorbell rang on Thursday afternoon. I'd been expecting a grocery delivery, so I opened the door without looking through the peephole first. Trent stood on my porch, holding a bouquet of red roses and wearing the apologetic expression I remembered from the early years of our marriage when he'd forgotten an anniversary or missed an important dinner. Hi, Claudia. You look. He paused, taking in my appearance. I was wearing old jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, my hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. You look tired. I've been better, I said, not moving to let him in. What are you doing here, Trent? I wanted to talk, to explain. He held out the roses. I brought these for you. Your favorites. I stared at the roses, noting that they were actually pink roses that were my favorites, not red. Trent had never been good at details like that, even after 28 years of marriage. I don't think we have anything to talk about. Please, Claudia. Just give me 5 minutes. There are things you need to know about Jessica. About why you what? I interrupted. Why you had an affair for 8 months. Why you waited until Christmas Eve to tell me. Why you threw away nearly 3 decades of marriage for someone half your age? My voice was rising, surprising both of us with its strength. I don't need explanations, Trent. I need you to leave. But he wasn't listening. He was staring past me into the house, his eyes widening as he took in the changes I'd made over the past few days. I'd rearranged the living room, moving his favorite chair into the garage and replacing it with a small desk where I'd been doing research on the Wellington Foundation. Books about nonprofit management and philanthropic strategy were scattered across the coffee table. "What's all this?" he asked, stepping closer to the doorway. "It's none of your business," I said, but I could see his salesman instincts kicking in, the way they always did when he sensed an opportunity or a threat. "Are you going back to school, Claudia? You're 55 years old. Don't you think you're a little old to be starting over?" The words hit me like a slap, a little old to be starting over. Just like Marcus had said in the park, sometimes the people who hurt us do us the biggest favor without meaning to. Hearing Trent's casual dismissal of my potential crystallized something inside me. "I think," I said slowly, "that 55 is exactly the right age to stop letting other people tell me what I'm capable of." Trent's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "Look, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But Jessica and it's not working out the way I thought it would." I blinked at him, processing what he'd just said. "Are you telling me you want to come back?" "I'm saying I made a mistake, a huge mistake." He ran his hand through his hair, the gesture I'd once found endearing now just seeming tired. "Jessica isn't. She's not what I thought she was. She's demanding, expensive. She expects me to pay for everything. And when I told her I couldn't afford the lifestyle she wanted, she started seeing someone else on the side." I stared at him, feeling something between disbelief and pity. "So you're here because your 28-year-old girlfriend dumped you for someone with more money?" "I'm here because I realized what I had with you, what I gave up." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We had something real, Claudia. Something stable. I was an idiot to think the grass was greener somewhere else." "Something stable," I repeated flatly. "Is that what you're calling 28 years of marriage? Something stable? You know what I mean. We were good together. We understood each other. We could be again." I looked at this man I'd loved for so long, really looked at him, and realized I was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. He wasn't offering love or passion or a chance to recapture what we'd lost. He was offering stability, convenience, the comfortable arrangement we'd settled into when we stopped being lovers and became roommates. "Tell me something, Trent," I said. "In all the years we were married, did you ever once tell someone I was remarkable? Did you ever brag about my accomplishments or tell your friends how proud you were of me?" He looked confused by the question. "Of course I was proud of you. You were a good nurse, a good wife." "A good wife," I interrupted. "Not an amazing woman or an incredible person. A good wife. Like I was a household appliance that worked properly." "That's not fair, Claudia. You're twisting my words." "Am I?" I thought about Marcus, about the way he'd looked at me when I offered him my boots. Like he was seeing something extraordinary in an ordinary moment. "When was the last time you saw me as anything other than your wife? When was the last time you were curious about what I thought or dreamed about or wanted for myself?" Trent opened his mouth, then closed it again. We both knew he couldn't answer that question. "I've been offered a job," I said, surprising myself by saying it out loud. "A really important job with a lot of responsibility and a salary that's almost twice what you make." His eyes narrowed. "What kind of job? Does it matter? The point is, someone thinks I'm capable of more than just being a good wife." "Claudia, be realistic. Who's going to hire a 55-year-old nurse for some high-paying executive position? It's probably a scam." There it was again, the casual dismissal, the assumption that I couldn't possibly be worth more than he'd valued me at. But this time, instead of making me feel small, it made me feel powerful. "You know what, Trent? You're right. I am being unrealistic. I'm being unrealistic to think that someone who spent 8 months lying to my face could suddenly develop the capacity to see my worth." I stepped back and started to close the door. "Thanks for the clarity." "Claudia, wait. No, we're done. We've been done since Christmas Eve, but I was too hurt to see it clearly. You did me a favor by leaving, and I'm not going to waste it by taking you back." I closed the door and leaned against it, listening to him call my name a few more times before finally giving up and walking away. Through the front window, I watched him get into his car and drive off, probably heading back to whatever temporary living situation he'd arranged after Jessica kicked him out. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt genuinely grateful to him. His casual cruelty, his assumption that I should be thankful for his willingness to settle for me again, had shown me exactly why I needed to take the leap Marcus was offering. I picked up the business card and dialed the number before I could lose my nerve. "Marcus Wellington's office," a professional voice answered. "This is Claudia Hayes. I'd like to speak with Mr. Wellington, please." "One moment." The hold music lasted maybe 10 seconds before Marcus's familiar voice came on the line. "Claudia, I was hoping you'd call." "I've been thinking about your offer," I said, pacing around my kitchen. "And I have some questions. Ask me anything. First, are you sure about this? Because I've spent the last 3 days researching nonprofit management, and I'm starting to realize how much I don't know." Marcus chuckled. "I'm more sure now than I was when I first made the offer. What else? If I take this job and I'm terrible at it, will you fire me? If you take this job and you're terrible at it, I'll get you whatever training and support you need to succeed. But Claudia, I don't think you understand yet what you showed me that night in the park." "What do you mean?" "Most people with your background would have walked past me. Most people with graduate degrees in nonprofit management would have walked past me. But you saw a need, and you filled it, immediately and completely, without calculating the cost to yourself. That's not a skill you can teach someone. That's character." I felt tears starting to form, but for the first time in days, they weren't tears of sadness. "When would you need an answer? When are you ready to give one?" I looked around my kitchen, at the house that had been my whole world for so long, at the life I'd built that had been so easily dismantled by someone else's choices. Then I thought about Marcus's wife, carrying that silver coin and believing that kindness was an investment that never failed. "I'm ready now," I said. "Yes, I want to do this." "Are you sure?" I smiled, feeling something like excitement bubbling up inside me for the first time in years. "I'm sure. When do I start?" "How about Monday? I'll have my assistant send you all the details, but plan on spending the first week just getting oriented, learning about our current programs, meeting the staff, understanding how everything works." "Okay, Marcus?" "Yes, thank you. For seeing something in me that I didn't even know was there." "Thank you," he said quietly. "For reminding me that there are still people in the world worth trusting." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the roses Trent had left on my porch step. They were already wilting in the cold, their petals brown at the edges. But through my window, I could see the first hints of spring in the trees, tiny buds that would soon burst into new life. I had a choice to make about those roses. I could bring them inside, try to revive them, pretend they were still beautiful, or I could leave them where they were and focus on what was coming next. I left them on the porch and went inside to start planning my new life. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, but I felt more energized than I had in months. I stood in front of my closet, staring at clothes that suddenly seemed to belong to someone else. The conservative blouses and cardigan sets I'd worn to church functions and dinner parties with Trent's colleagues felt like costumes from a play I no longer wanted to be in. Instead, I chose a navy blue dress I'd bought years ago but never worn because Trent said it was too bold for a woman my age. Looking at myself in the mirror, I realized it wasn't too bold at all. It was exactly right for the woman I was becoming. The Wellington Foundation occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower, all glass and steel and views that stretched to the horizon. As the elevator carried me up to the 32nd floor, I felt my stomach flutter with nerves and excitement in equal measure. "Mrs. Hayes?" A young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile approached as soon as the elevator doors opened. "I'm Sarah Chen, Mr. Wellington's assistant. He's waiting for you in the conference room." I followed her through hallways lined with photographs of projects the foundation had funded. A children's hospital in Guatemala, a scholarship program for inner-city students, a water purification system in rural Africa. Each image told a story of lives changed, hope restored, futures made possible. Marcus was standing by a wall of windows when I entered the conference room, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the city below. He turned when he heard me come in, and his face lit up with a genuine smile. "Claudia, you look wonderful. Ready for your first day?" "As ready as someone can be when they're not entirely sure what they're getting into," I admitted. He laughed. "Honesty. I like that. Come, let me show you what we're working with." The next 4 hours were a whirlwind of information. Marcus introduced me to the Foundation's staff, 12 dedicated people who managed everything from grant applications to program monitoring to financial oversight. They were polite, but clearly skeptical about this middle-aged nurse who'd somehow landed a senior position without any relevant experience. "Our current approach is very reactive," explained Janet Morrison, the interim director who'd been running things since the previous director left 6 months earlier. "We receive applications, review them against our criteria, and either approve or deny funding. It's efficient, but impersonal," I finished, thinking about all the times I'd dealt with insurance companies and hospital administrators who treated patients as claim numbers rather than human beings. Janet nodded, looking surprised. "Exactly. We rarely have direct contact with the people we're supposedly helping." Marcus leaned forward in his chair. "That's one of the things I'd like to change. I want us to be more involved, more connected to the actual impact of our work." Over lunch, Marcus and I sat alone in his office while he explained his vision more fully. "My wife used to say that charity without relationship is just guilt management. Rich people writing checks to feel better about their wealth without actually understanding or addressing the root causes of suffering." "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," I said, remembering the silver coin that now sat on my dresser at home. "She was. She grew up poor, worked her way through college, became a social worker. She never let me forget that privilege comes with responsibility, but also that responsibility without compassion is just bureaucracy." I thought about my own experiences with bureaucracy during my nursing career. The times I'd watched patients suffer because someone in an office somewhere had decided their needs didn't fit the right category. What if we started visiting the organizations we fund? Not just the big, established ones, but the small grassroots groups that are doing work, but don't have the resources to write impressive grant applications. Marcus's eyes lit up. "Tell me more about that." "Well, I've seen how the system works in hospitals. The programs that get funding are the ones with the best marketing, not necessarily the ones doing the most good. What if we went out and looked for the people who are making a difference but don't have the connections or the fancy presentations?" "Field research," Marcus mused. "Direct observation. I love it." We spent the rest of the afternoon sketching out ideas for a more hands-on approach to philanthropy. By the time 5 o'clock arrived, I felt like I'd found something I'd been searching for my entire life without knowing it. The week continued in much the same way. Each day brought new challenges, new learning opportunities, new ways of thinking about how wealth could be used to create meaningful change. The foundation staff, initially wary, began to warm up to me as they saw that I was genuinely interested in their expertise and willing to admit what I didn't know. It was Friday afternoon when my old life came calling. I was in my temporary office, reviewing applications for medical equipment grants, when Sarah knocked on my doorframe. "Mrs. Hayes? There's a man here to see you. He says he's your husband." My stomach clenched. "Thank you, Sarah. Please tell him I'll be right there." Trent was waiting in the reception area, looking uncomfortable and out of place among the foundation's modern furnishings. He'd dressed up for the occasion, wearing his best suit and the tie I'd bought him for his last birthday, but he still managed to look shabby compared to the understated elegance around him. "Hello, Trent," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see where you're working," he said, his eyes darting around the space with barely concealed amazement. "Claudia, this place is incredible. How did you even get a job here?" "I was offered the position," I said simply. "What do you want?" He lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "I want to talk about us, about our future. We don't have a future, Trent. I thought I made that clear. You're not thinking straight," he said, and I heard the familiar, condescending tone that I'd somehow learned to tolerate over the years. "You're making decisions based on anger and hurt feelings instead of logic." "Am I?" I crossed my arms. "What's the logical thing to do, in your opinion?" "Come home. We can work through this. Marriage is about forgiveness, about giving people second chances." He gestured around the reception area. "This job, this whole thing, it's not real, Claudia. You're playing dress-up in someone else's world." Before I could respond, Marcus appeared from the direction of the elevators. He took in the scene quickly, my tense posture, Trent's aggressive stance, the uncomfortable silence that had fallen over the reception area. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice polite but carrying an undertone of authority that made Trent take a step back. "Marcus Wellington," I said, grateful for the interruption. "This is my ex-husband, Trent Hayes. Trent, this is Mr. Wellington, the CEO of Wellington Industries and the founder of this foundation." I watched Trent's face change as the name registered. His eyes widened, then narrowed, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. "Mr. Wellington," Trent said, extending his hand with the forced enthusiasm of a salesman. "It's an honor to meet you. I have to say, I'm impressed by what you've built here." Marcus shook his hand briefly, then stepped closer to me. "Claudia has been an invaluable addition to our team this week. We're very fortunate to have someone with her wisdom and compassion leading our new community outreach initiative." "Community outreach," Trent repeated, his tone making it sound like something distasteful. "That's interesting. Claudia always did have a soft spot for lost causes." The words hung in the air like a challenge. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger, but before I could respond, Marcus spoke. "I've found that the people who dismiss compassion as weakness are usually the ones who've never had the courage to practice it themselves," he said calmly. "If you'll excuse us, Claudia and I have a meeting to attend." He placed a gentle hand on my elbow, guiding me toward the elevators. As we waited for the doors to open, I could feel Trent's eyes boring into my back. "Claudia?" Trent called out, his voice carrying a note of desperation I'd never heard before. "This won't last. These people don't really know you like I do. When they figure out who you really are, you'll come crawling back." The elevator doors opened, and Marcus and I stepped inside. As they closed, cutting off Trent's angry face, I realized I was shaking. "Are you all right?" Marcus asked gently. "I think so. I'm sorry about that. He had no right to come here." "Don't apologize. But can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Is that really how he sees you? As someone who wastes time on lost causes?" I thought about all the years I'd downplayed my volunteer work, the way I'd learned to make my nursing career sound like a hobby rather than a calling, the countless times I'd apologized for caring too much about people Trent considered unimportant. He always said I was too emotional, too invested in other people's problems. He thought it made me naive. Marcus was quiet for a moment as the elevator rose toward his office. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My wife used to tell me that the world has two kinds of people, those who see suffering and turn away, and those who see suffering and step toward it. She said the first group runs the world, but the second group saves it." The elevator doors opened, and as we walked toward his office, Marcus continued, "What your ex-husband calls naivety, I call courage. What he sees as weakness, I see as strength. He's wrong about you, Claudia. And more importantly, he's wrong about what matters in this world." That evening, I drove home through the city lights, thinking about the week I'd just completed. 5 days ago, I'd been a discarded wife with no clear future. Tonight, I was the director of community outreach for one of the largest charitable foundations in the country, with a salary that would let me build whatever life I wanted. But more than that, I was working with someone who valued the same things I did, who saw my compassion as an asset rather than a weakness. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed that the roses Trent had left on my porch were completely dead now, their petals scattered by the wind. But in my garden, the daffodils I'd planted last fall were beginning to push through the soil, bright green shoots reaching toward the spring sun. I gathered up the dead roses and threw them in the trash, then went inside to call my sister in California and tell her about my new life. For the first time in months, I had good news to share. 6 months later, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my new apartment, adjusting the silver necklace that had become my signature piece, the one Marcus had given me after our first major foundation success. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized from that snowy Christmas morning when my world fell apart. My hair was shorter now, cut in a style that actually flattered my face instead of hiding it. I'd learned to wear makeup that enhanced rather than concealed, and my clothes reflected confidence rather than the desire to be invisible. But the biggest change wasn't physical. It was in my eyes. They held a light that hadn't been there for years. Today marked our foundation's most ambitious project launch yet, the Second Chances Community Center in the neighborhood where I'd first met Marcus. It was fitting somehow that we were returning to the place where both of our lives had changed forever. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of learning, growing, and discovering capabilities I'd never known I possessed. Our new approach to philanthropy, getting out of the office and into the communities we served, had revolutionized the way Wellington Foundation operated. Instead of waiting for grant applications to come to us, we actively sought out grassroots organizations that were making a difference but lacked resources. I'd traveled to inner-city schools where teachers were buying supplies with their own money, visited homeless shelters run by volunteers who'd once been homeless themselves, and met with community leaders who were fighting food deserts with urban gardens and neighborhood markets. Each visit had taught me something new about resilience, about the power of people to lift themselves up when given just a little support. The Foundation's impact has increased by 300% since we implemented your community-first model, Marcus had told me just last week, showing me the latest reports. But more importantly, we're actually seeing lives change. Real, measurable change. Today's grand opening was the culmination of everything we'd learned. The Second Chances Community Center would provide job training, childcare, addiction counseling, and educational programs all under one roof. But more than that, it would be a place where people could find dignity and hope, regardless of their circumstances. As I drove to the event, I thought about how different this drive was from that terrible Christmas Eve journey 6 months ago. Then, I'd been fleeing heartbreak with no destination in mind. Now, I was heading toward something I'd helped create, something that would outlast me and make the world a little bit better. The center was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Local news crews were setting up their equipment, community members were touring the facilities, and children were already using the new playground equipment we'd installed in the courtyard. I found Marcus near the main entrance, talking with the center's director, a woman named Rosa who'd been born in this neighborhood and had worked her way through college before returning to help others do the same. When he saw me approaching, his face lit up with the warm smile I'd come to cherish. "There she is," he said, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "The woman who made all this possible." "We made this possible," I corrected, but I felt a flush of pride at his words. Rosa hugged me tightly. "Mrs. Hayes, I can't thank you enough. When you came to visit our little program 6 months ago, we were operating out of someone's basement with a budget of $500 a month. Now look at this place." I looked around at the bright, welcoming space, the computer lab where people could learn new skills, the childcare center where working parents could leave their children safely, the meeting rooms where support groups would gather. It was everything we'd dreamed of and more. You were already changing lives, Rosa. We just gave you a bigger space to do it in. The dedication ceremony was simple but moving. Marcus gave a speech about the importance of investing in communities rather than just programs. Rosa spoke about the transformative power of having people believe in you. And I found myself talking about second chances, about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the doorway to the best thing. 6 months ago, I told the gathered crowd, I thought my life was over. I thought I was too old, too ordinary, too set in my ways to start again. But I learned something important. It's never too late to discover who you're meant to be. As I spoke, I caught sight of a familiar figure at the back of the crowd. Trent was standing near the parking lot, partially hidden behind a news van. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Respect, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of regret. After the ceremony, as people mingled and children played, I found myself standing in the courtyard garden, admiring the vegetables and flowers that community volunteers had planted. The space reminded me of my mother's garden, where she'd taught me that nurturing small things could yield big results. Beautiful, isn't it? Marcus appeared beside me, holding 2 cups of coffee from the center's new cafe. It's perfect, I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Your wife would have loved this place. Marcus nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. She would have loved you. The way you've transformed this foundation, the way you see possibilities where others see problems. He paused, seeming to gather his courage. Claudia, there's something I've been wanting to tell you. I looked at him, noting the nervous energy that seemed so unlike his usual composed demeanor. These past 6 months working alongside you have been the happiest I've been since Elizabeth died. You've helped me remember that there's still beauty in the world, still reasons to hope. He set down his coffee and turned to face me fully. I know we work together, and I know you're still healing from your divorce, but I have to ask, would you consider having dinner with me tonight? Not as colleagues, but as more? I felt my heart skip a beat. Over the months, I'd noticed the way Marcus looked at me, the way our hands lingered when they touched, the way our conversations had become more personal and intimate, but I'd told myself I was imagining things, that a man like him could never be interested in someone like me. Marcus, I began, but he held up his hand. Before you answer, I want you to know something. That night in the park when you gave me your boots, you saved more than my feet from frostbite. You saved my faith in humanity. You reminded me that there are still people in the world who care more about doing right than doing well. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out my old brown boots, the ones he'd had cleaned and returned months ago. I've been carrying these in my car ever since you gave them back to me. They remind me of the moment I met the most extraordinary woman I've ever known. I stared at the boots, remembering that snowy night when I'd felt like my life was ending. How could I have known that in giving away something so simple, I was opening the door to everything I'd never dared to dream of? Yes, I said quietly. Yes? Yes, I'll have dinner with you. Yes, I'd like to see where this leads. I smiled, feeling bold and nervous and hopeful all at once. But Marcus? Anything. I'm keeping the boots this time. They're part of my story now, part of who I've become. He laughed, pulling me into a gentle hug that felt like coming home. I wouldn't have it any other way. As the afternoon faded into evening and the last of the visitors departed, Marcus and I found ourselves alone in the garden, surrounded by the promise of growing things. In the distance, the city lights were beginning to twinkle, but here, in this small oasis, everything felt peaceful and full of possibility. Can I tell you something? I said, leaning against Marcus's shoulder as we sat on a bench overlooking the vegetable plots. Of course. 6 months ago, when Trent left me, I thought I was being thrown away like something that had outlived its usefulness. But I realize now that I wasn't being thrown away. I was being set free. Marcus squeezed my hand. Free to become who you were always meant to be. Free to find someone who sees me the way you do. Someone who values kindness over convenience, compassion over comfort. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the building behind us, Rosa was turning off lights and locking doors, securing this place we'd built together, this testament to the power of second chances. My mother used to say that gardens teach us about hope, I said eventually. You plant seeds not knowing if they'll grow. You tend them through storms and droughts. And sometimes, if you're patient and faithful, you get to see them bloom. Marcus turned to look at me, his eyes soft in the twilight. Is that what this is? What we're building together? I thought about the foundation we'd transformed, the lives we'd touched, the love that was growing between us like something tender and strong. Yes, I said. I think it is. As we walked back to our cars, Marcus carrying my old boots like precious cargo, I realized that Trent had been wrong about so many things. He'd said this new life wouldn't last, that I'd come crawling back when people figured out who I really was. But they had figured out who I really was, and it turned out to be someone worth investing in, someone worth believing in, someone worth loving. Not the woman who tried to make herself small to fit into someone else's life, but the woman who had the courage to give her boots to a stranger on a snowy night. That woman, it turned out, was exactly who I was meant to be all along. 3 years later, I would stand in the same garden at my wedding reception, surrounded by the community we'd helped nurture and the love we'd grown together. Marcus would joke in his speech that he'd proposed to me twice, once as a homeless man asking for help, and once as himself asking for my heart. Both times he'd say I'd given him exactly what he needed. But that night, as I drove home to the life I'd built for myself, I knew the truth. In giving him what he needed, I'd finally found what I needed too. Not someone to complete me, but someone to grow alongside. Not someone to take care of me, but someone who treasured the way I took care of others. The silver coin from Marcus's wife still sat on my dresser, its inscription a daily reminder. Kindness is the only investment that never fails. Looking back, I could see that every act of kindness, from the boots I'd given a stranger to the foundation we'd built together, had returned to me multiplied, transformed into something more beautiful than I could have imagined. Sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. Sometimes the worst day of your life is the first day of your real life. Sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, giving away your boots to a stranger in the snow can lead you to exactly where you belong. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.